One more word to the church before I begin today's sermon. You all are being blessed in 1,000 times 1,000 ways. You're about to experience the new beginning of a new building, which you anticipated for a long time, and by no means deserve. I mean, the blessings of God in our world, in our lives, in this country are totally beyond measure. And we have such an abundance of God's love and presence and care in our lives. And there's only two things you can do with a blessing like that. The first one is you give thanks. You're aware of it and you give thanks. And the second one is you give it away. You become a blessing to others. I was writing a sermon for another church recently, and I was trying to summarize what I understood to be the purpose of my life. And as I really thought about it, it comes down to that simple idea. We are blessed in order to be a blessing. That's what God did with the people of Israel. He called them as His children and blessed them as His children, and then said, go out and be a blessing to the world. You haven't earned this, you haven't deserved it. It all comes by way of my loving you and being a God of blessing. So you've been blessed by wonderful people, lots of children, young people. You've been blessed by some great leaders. And go out and be a blessing to others. Well, the beginning of my sermon is going to sound quite a bit different than all that, so be prepared. Murder, she wrote. From the sublime to the ridiculous, right? Colombo, Riverdale, Midsummer Murders, Wallander, Dexter. Anyone here willing to confess that you've watched and been intrigued by some of Dexter? I don't want to tell you my own story about that. Agatha Christie's Perot, Shetland, Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, Broadchurch, Hinterland, Luther, Criminal Minds, Marcella, The Following, The Fugitive, The Fall, and I had just begun. Kathy and I got a new network on our smart TV, and we're now watching Amazon Prime, and they have an eternally available, unending supply of murder mysteries, mostly coming out of England. So you'll never run out. What do these TV series have in common? They're all about murder. How many of us watch murder mysteries on TV or at the theater? Or find real-life murders? Who did kill John Benet Ramsey? Why did O.J. get away with it? Murder! Okay, back to our story from Genesis 4, 1 through 16. That is our text for today, and I'll be reading it as we go along. Some versions of the Bible add subtitles to the scripture lessons. They say this is the parable of the Good Samaritan or the Ten Commandments. Those subtitles weren't in the text. They're added by editors or people trying to make the Bible more accessible. They're not divinely inspired and they're not inerrant. They're just some editors' understanding of the theme of the text. Well, I reread this story again as if for the first time, asking God for new insight. And I ended up giving the story a new title. It's a headline. It's just my title. It's what I heard God saying. But I really think it's a better title. I entitled this whole section of Scripture, God Never Abandons Us. Strange. Did you choose that phrase for us because you knew the theme of the sermon? See? There it is. This hymn that we sang, here's a why missing God's mercy. It was 40-something. Yeah, listen to these lines again. But we make God's love too narrow by false limits of our own, and we magnify His strictness with a zeal that's not God's own. We try to make God into more of an angry and vengeful, judgmental God than God is. That's what the verses, all the verses point in that direction. I also then consider this headline for the Cain and Abel story. How does God deal with sinners? What if murder is not the theme of the story, but simply the first and foremost a context, an opportunity for the people of God to share with the pagan world their understanding of the nature of God? All around Israel, there were tribes and nations that believed their gods were deities of unlimited power, unmitigated violence, angry gods, punishing gods, unforgiving gods that had to be placated with sacrifices, like even the sacrifice of children. In a recent sermon, I shared the considered opinion of most Bible scholars that the creation stories of Genesis were written specifically with the purpose of opposing the predominant creation stories of Israel's neighbors, stories about violent and hateful gods fighting battles in otherworldly realms. Their creation stories, all the nations that surrounded Israel, taught that the earth and all the creatures of the earth, especially people, were nothing but the debris left over when dark divinities did battle with each other in heaven. Not a good creation as declared by Genesis, a foul, revolting, wicked creation, foul, revolting, wicked God, merciless God. Israel introduced the world to another vision of creation, and especially another vision of God whose name is love. So it was in Genesis 4, 1 through 17, the people of God are intent on establishing for everyone a radically new image of God. And what if the purpose of the story is in fact to answer the question, what does God do with sinners? What does God do with sinners? Not what we do with them. Or even more radical, how does a God of blessing bless Cain and every other sinner? Wherein I then have told you what I interpret the story to mean. What does God do to bless Cain? So maybe you're willing to consider with me a new way of looking at Genesis 4, 1 through 17, that it really is a story about grace and mercy. And maybe you're going to be willing to understand that it was editors and people like us that called this a murder mystery. Because we all so easily get sucked into the black hole of homicidal intrigue. Well, after striving with all spiritual, emotional, and physical strength to read Genesis 4, 1 through 17 again for the first time, and trying to give serious contemplative attention to what God wanted me to see in the story, I decided that today might be an opportunity for all of us to get to know God better as the merciful one, the protector, and the source of all compassion. So let's return to the story. I'll read a section, comment on it, and I'm doing it that way so you can see very clearly that as I preach this message, I'm staying very close to the text and not inventing anything out of nowhere. So I call the first section of the text, Children Are Born, Grow Up, and Worship. Now the man Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. And in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel, for his part, brought the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. Now, I only really want to make two comments about this opening of our text. Please notice, because most of the time we don't even notice it, that Eve gives credit to God for God's role in the birth of her son. Even though Eve was sent forth to give childbirth in labor, that did not mean that God left her behind. God was with her in the conception and the delivery of Eve. She gave birth with the help of God. God never abandoned her. Second, I do not know why God favored Abel and his gift and did not favor Cain and his sacrifice. Many people have come up with theories. But if I was pressed, I would hazard a guess that the disfavor of Cain had much more to do with his attitude than with his gift. So let's see what we find in the next verses. And I call these next verses, God announces the blessing of choice. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you so angry? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. See that? Cain had an attitude. An angry attitude. God tells Cain that Cain and I believe all of us have a choice of what we're going to do with our attitude. God tells Cain that he has the power to master his anger and every other feeling or motivation that drives him away from God. Cain is not, and we are not, God is extremely clear about this, Cain is not possessed by some kind of unconquerable sin nature that forces him to do the wrong thing. Cain has a choice. So do we. As Christians, we know we have a choice, and we can grow in our capacity to live holy lives by growing towards a greater measure of the fullness of Christ. But it's a choice. The Israelites who recorded and transmitted every verse of the Old Testament knew beyond any shadow of a doubt, you see it in hundreds of stories, that they could choose life or they could choose death. I call the next section, Cain chooses rage and sin and kills Abel. Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Cain chose murder. He did not have to sin. He chose sin. Cain was not possessed by, and we are not possessed by, a dark and malevolent spirit that makes us a prisoner of sin. We are free to choose. This fact is extraordinarily clear in this story. God told Cain, and God tells us in stories like this, that, and there are thousands of them again, that we can choose life, that we and our descendants might live. When we hear repeated warnings about the catastrophic consequences of something like global warming, it is comforting to read a story like this and to know that we can make choices that determine the future for ourselves and our descendants, our children. We can make good choices or bad choices. Cain chose murder. Just yesterday I got angry. You know, it happens. And I chose to spout off some words that were hurtful. But what about you? What did you choose yesterday? And what will you choose tomorrow? I call the next section of the text, God encounters Cain again on the transgression field. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain chose murder. Tragically, that was not the end of Cain's sin. Next, Cain chose the denial of responsibility. This pattern repeats itself in all of our lives with a wide array of consequences. You see, it's always injurious to sin. Somebody always gets hurt. But when we lie, when the guilty protest their innocence and do not own up, harmful can quickly become catastrophic. It becomes catastrophic first because the sin can become a habit or an addiction, and it is so much harder to be recovered from an addiction than it is to say I'm sorry for a mistake. Second, when we deny responsibility, others get blamed. We say the devil made me do it. We blame others and become fraudulent witnesses, and in some cases a person is put to death on the gallows because of the witness of false witnesses. I'd like at this point in this sermon to just say a few amusing things because it's rather a heavy topic, you know. So, have you ever been to camp? You sing a lot of really dumb songs at camp. My dad, who by the way was an interim minister here in the late 1970s, before at least half of you were even born. My dad was also a director of camps, and he would get up to do the announcements, and you might want to try this when your people do announcements. You start singing announcements, announcements, announcements. Director has another one, you know, and you keep on singing. My dad really took it well. But there was this other really great song that everybody did, and I think they still do this one. So let's say that there's this guy named Joel who's kind of a troublemaker, and he gets his whole table to point at somebody and says, "What's your name?" Karen. Karen stole the cookie from the cookie jar. And Karen's eating this big, yummy mouthful of spaghetti. And she said, "Not me!" And they say, "Then who?" And then they all point to Julie stole the cookie from the cookie jar. "Not me." "Then who?" "Oh, Bobby over there." "Yeah, Bobby." And they just keep pointing and singing and, you know, fun time. The chant continues to echo. Blaming is a habit. Pointing fingers at others is not a requisite of our human nature, it's a choice. God tells us we can master this habit, modify the routine, heal the addiction and irresponsibility, convert our character to candor, and especially get to know a merciful God who forgives and protects and loves us as an unalterable fixed attribute of the character of God. No matter what, Genesis 1 through 14 testifies at the very beginning of our spiritual tradition that God never abandons us. So we never have to be afraid of telling God the truth. Okay, the next section, Cain talks about how he's horrified by the consequences of his sin. And there are three consequences, and Cain gets the point right away. He loses his capacity to be a good farmer. He loses his relationship with God. And he's terrified that someone might murder him. And what does God say? How does God address the sinner? God says, "Not so." A moderator drowning in the cesspool of murder mysteries and retribution might protest, "Excuse me, what's that you say? No vengeance?" And again, God pronounces, "No way, that's not my way." And addicted to the myth of redemptive violence, the modern reader of Genesis again protests, "You call that justice? Hanging from the highest tree." God protects Cain. Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance." And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one came upon him to kill him. And Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden, whereby God, by the way, God already is. It's a really interesting story. I'm not preaching on this part of the story today because I don't know quite what to make of it. I'd have to do some conversing with God to come up with an idea. But, you know, the way the story ends, Cain has this mark on him, but he heads off to Eden. And there what happens? He gets married. And he probably has children. And he probably continues a pretty decent life under the circumstances. That's the way the story seems to end. He just goes off and starts over. I don't know quite what to do with that. But God pronounces justice in a way that's so different than we people do it. He's a marked man for sure. But the M that he wears around his neck is not like the ball and chain worn by the ghost of Marley in Dickens' A Christmas Carol. He just goes off to Eden and gets married, probably has children. And this man Cain does not wear a mark that will forever shame and endanger him. It's not like the Scarlet Letter in Nathaniel Hawthorne's book. Hester was a sinful woman in that story. But the real sin in the story is not Hester. The real sin is a Puritan culture that cannot forgive and that uses judgment to condemn and destroy people's lives. Certainly Hester sinned, but the world around her was trapped in sin and did not even dimly approach the brilliantly luminous mercy of God. Well, I must close today by reminding all of you that there's not just one way to understand Bible stories. God may give you a distinct interpretation, and a year from now, if I return to this story and talk to God about what I need to say about it, I may get a whole different message. But however, what I can say with absolute certainty today, that this word, that God never abandons us, this word, that God is always a God of blessing who wants to protect us, this word, God loves us, forgives us, and longs to be reconciled with us. This is the word of the Lord. This is the word of the Lord that's been given me to preach. God will never, no, never, no, never forsake you. So be it. Amen.